Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is basically your hormone system. So we're going to be looking at how hormones function and the mechanisms of how they work. The major endocrine organs, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, are the major controllers of the endocrine system. And then we'll be looking at some individual glands like the thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, thymus, pineal gland, and some local hormones that act as chemical messengers. Okay, so when we talk about an endocrine glands, they secrete into the bloodstream. So they're going to secrete their products, which are hormones, into the extracellular fluid, which will eventually make its way into the bloodstream. They are a type of chemical messenger in the body. Another type of chemical messenger in the body was neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are when you talk from neuron A to neuron B or neuron A to a muscle, whereas hormones, they can travel throughout the entire body system in the bloodstream. So neurotransmitters are more localized, hormones are more widespread. It's very highly coordinated though with the nervous system. So the brain is one of the major controllers of our endocrine system. Now, exocrine glands, they secrete their gland products into ducts, so not directly into the bloodstream. So they're ducted glands. This is going to be things like your sweat glands and your oil glands and your saliva glands. They're called salivary glands. Those are examples of those. Okay, so this is just showing you guys endocrine glands. So here's your endocrine organ. It's making its hormone product and it's dropping it into the bloodstream. Whereas here, this is a sebaceous gland, which is an oil gland that nourishes the hair follicle, and that's just emptying right into a duct into that hair follicle. All right, there are some major endocrine glands that we will discuss. We have the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, your parathyroid gland, your adrenal glands, and your pineal gland. Some organs that secrete hormones, but they're not a full endocrine gland. They just have endocrine tissue. This is going to be the hypothalamus, thymus, pancreas, ovaries, testes. Basically what this means is they have other jobs other than secreting hormones. Heart, placenta, stomach, small intestines, kidneys. Especially when you look at the heart, you're not thinking, oh my God, that is secreting hormones. You're thinking about it pumping blood, right? Okay, and so we can look through here. We can see there, this is a great slide because this just really gives you a nice summary of what each gland does. And we will go over that throughout these slides here. But you can see in the brain here, we have your hypothalamus is right here. So that's kind of right there. And then hanging off your hypothalamus is your pituitary gland. We did see this in lab, so that should be familiar to you. And that pituitary gland is going to secrete hormones that will act on glands to release other hormones. And the hypothalamus will influence that pituitary gland. Okay, so hormones travel in the bloodstream. They usually have a particular type of cell that they affect. And so cells have receptors on them. And cells, when they want a response to that hormone or they want more hormone, they can make more receptors. So they can either upregulate or downregulate their receptors there. And so, you know, some hormones, such as like insulin, that can act on almost all of the cells in our body. But other hormones, such as like, let's see, let me give you an example of like prolactin. Prolactin stimulates milk production in breast tissue. That does not act on that doesn't act on muscle tissue. That doesn't act on bone tissue. And so, you know, cells, they need those specific receptors to work with that specific hormone. There's two types of hormones. You have what's called lipid soluble and you have what's called water soluble. Now remember, your plasma membrane are made of phospholipids. So hormones that are lipid soluble, they will be easily able to cross through your cell membranes, whereas water soluble types of hormones, those are usually your protein based hormones. So these are usually your protein based hormones. These are going to usually need some sort of receptor that will influence intracellular activity. So basically what that means is they can't get into the cell. They can attach onto the cell and cause it to do something, but they can't pass through that cell membrane. So lipid soluble, they can pass through the cell membrane. Examples of lipid soluble membranes, lipid soluble hormones are steroid hormones. Those are derived from cholesterol. They're made from cholesterol. That's going to include the family of like estrogen, testosterone. So your male and female hormones, another one is aldosterone. Cortisol is another. So there's quite a few, but to be honest, most numerous type of hormones are going to be your water soluble, your protein based hormones. And so the main organs right here that secrete steroid hormones, we talked about that, are ovaries, testes, and adrenal glands. These adrenal glands, they are going to be secreting, these are the ones that secrete the cortisol. And these are going to secrete another one called aldosterone. Ovaries and testes, we're looking at estrogen, progesterone. These are both for female. And then testosterone, that is for male. All right, so I had mentioned before, I'm going to show you this picture. Here's a steroid hormone. A steroid hormone is able to easily pass through the membrane because the cell membrane is made of lipids. So lipids let their friends in, right? So if a steroid hormone, this is a lipid. And so what's unique about steroid hormones is they will come into the cell, they will find their receptors inside the cell, and they actually go into the nucleus. Pretty cool. And they actually attach onto DNA. And so lipid-soluble hormones, they are known for activating genes in your DNA. And then that gene can cause a protein to be made. So what's crazy is that a lipid acts on your DNA, which causes a protein to be made. And you can see this channel right here. Water-soluble hormones, these are made of amino acids. If you remember, amino acids make up proteins. They cannot pass through the lipid layer of the plasma membrane, and so they exert their effect by binding to receptors on the cell surface. And so this causes some intracellular activity. They basically interact with what's called second messengers. So they use a second messenger system. One of the most common ones is cyclic AMP, and a lot of drugs can actually affect this. So let's see what we have. A picture right here. We have a water-soluble hormone. Let me get my pen going here. You have a water-soluble hormone. This would be a protein-based hormone. You can see it attaching onto the receptor, and then it activates a bunch of intracellular activity. All right, and so here's your little summary here of lipid-soluble versus water-soluble. Lipid-soluble goes into the cell, stimulates the synthesis of proteins via DNA, gene activation. Water-soluble hormones, they activate proteins already in the cell. They do this without entering the cell. They use, and I'll add this right here, they use what's called a second messenger because they cannot get in the cell. So they use a second messenger system. Okay, negative feedback. So how does these glands know when to secrete these hormones? They usually respond to blood levels of the hormones, and so you get this feedback that feeds back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which control your endocrine glands. And so the glands themselves or the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus can all work by what's called negative feedback. Now, positive feedback would be the further stimulating the process. There's very little examples of this in the hormone level except for one example right here, and that is when you have the uterine contractions. So the uterine contractions, that is caused by oxytocin. So when you're delivering a baby, the uterus is contracting. The hormone oxytocin acts on the smooth muscle cells of the uterus, all right? And so what's happening is that rising levels of estrogen towards the end of pregnancy sort of stimulate more release of oxytocin. And you can see here, you've got this little response here. We have the head of the baby reaching down into the cervix. The stretching, okay, it said hormones previously, but as it gets closer to like the day, the stretching of the cervix right there, and that's why they talk about how dilated your cervix is, that will feed back on the hypothalamus to release more oxytocin. Interactions between hormones, sometimes the effect of one hormone opposes that of the other. There's a couple examples of that, like insulin and glucagon. Those work in opposition. Estrogen and progesterone, those work at different types of your cycle there. Some need to work together, okay? Some work together, so it improves the response. So that's called synergistic right here. Like epinephrine and glucagon do that with responding to glucose release into the bloodstream. And permissiveness, one hormone must be present for another hormone to exert its effect. Thyroid hormone works with a lot of the sex hormones to do that. So thyroid hormone is one of those. All right. The pituitary gland, so now we're going to talk about each organ individually. So the pituitary gland is divided into two lobes, an anterior and a posterior. The anterior is connected via bloodstream to the hypothalamus, and the posterior has a direct neural connection to that. And so the hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones. So the hypothalamus basically tells the pituitary gland what to release and what not to release. You can see this connection right here. Here's your anterior pituitary gland. Here's your posterior pituitary gland. These are representing veins. These are representing blood vessels right here. It's a portal system. And so you can see here the anterior pituitary gland is going to secrete hormones into the bloodstream, which will affect all of these glands. Okay, and it shows you which hormone does that. So thyroid stimulating hormone, let's look at this one. Thyroid stimulating hormone causes the thyroid gland, which will release thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, that stimulates the adrenal gland to release like aldosterone, and we'll see cortisol. Prolactin stimulates milk production in the mammary glands. Growth hormone acts on your bones and your muscles. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, that affects the ovaries, so egg and sperm, how they're made. And you can see here we have a blood connection between the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus talking to the posterior pituitary gland is a direct neural connection. That's, you can see these little green things right here. These are actual neurons. Now, the hypothalamus makes the products ADH and oxytocin, and the pituitary gland just releases it out. ADH acts on your kidneys, and that's going to reabsorb any water that's basically destined for the toilet. And oxytocin is going to act on your, it's actually going to cause milk ejection, not milk production. Prolactin causes milk production, but oxytocin is going to cause contractions of the smooth muscle in the uterus. The anterior pituitary gland, it makes these 6 hormones. You can see them right here: growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Those specifically act on the male and female, as we saw in the previous picture. I told you guys that the hypothalamus does regulate the release of these hormones. So this is just one example. Growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. This will control the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So growth hormone, this stimulates basically metabolism, muscle, cartilage growth, all that. It's very active during your early childhood years. If you have a tumor in the area of the pituitary gland, it can affect the secretion of this hormone. And so abnormally high production of growth hormone in childhood, you can end up with what's called gigantism. In adulthood, it's called acromegalia. And so you just basically grow more kind of as you get older. But you could also have a decreased secretion of growth hormone, and you can result in a dwarfism. There's many different types of dwarfism that exist out there. Okay, just some pictures here. Another hormone that's secreted is prolactin. It stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. It needs to have certain levels, actually, so you can have issues with this if you have abnormal levels of it, even in males too as well. So, but primarily it's there to stimulate the mammary glands to produce milk during pregnancy. It's normally inhibited all the time unless you're pregnant. Now, there's hormones that come from the anterior lobe that secrete other glands, to secrete other hormones. So, for example, we're going to have thyroid stimulating hormone. This is going to act on your thyroid gland, and this is going to cause your thyroid gland to release what's called thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, this is going to act on your adrenal gland, and this is going to cause the release of cortisol. FSH and LH, these two are going to be acting on your ovaries if you are a female, or your testes if you are a male. Usually FSH would be either sperm or egg production. And LH is different in males to females. LH in a female, it causes ovulation. In a male, it causes testosterone production. Sorry, my pen is getting kind of messy here. Okay, testosterone production. Okay, so this thyroid stimulating hormone, like we said, it acts on the thyroid gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, it causes the release of glucocorticoid hormones, that's cortisol. Follicle stimulating hormone, we're looking at egg. In males, we're looking at sperm. We can see luteinizing hormone, it's going to be causing ovulation, and in male, it's going to be causing the release of testosterone. Okay, the posterior lobe secretes ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. I told you guys ADH and oxytocin are made in the hypothalamus, and they travel via nerve cells to the posterior pituitary gland. And in the posterior pituitary gland, they will release them. So what's the big difference between the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland is the anterior pituitary gland, it makes and it secretes the hormones, whereas the posterior pituitary gland, it only secretes, it does not make. The hypothalamus makes its hormones. Antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. If there's types of drugs that can affect this, they call them vasopressive, like drugs. And so usually what it does is it acts on the kidneys, and it tells any water that's destined for the toilet, it takes it back to the body. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions and milk ejection from the breast tissue. It may have some influence on males, so this would be mostly secreted in higher amounts towards the end of pregnancy and right after birth. And so you can see here we have a discussion here. We have this little steps here. You have the suckling of the baby on the breast tissue. This actually sends feedback. It's a positive feedback mechanism to release oxytocin, and oxytocin causes milk ejection. So this is an example of a positive feedback mechanism in addition to the uterine contractions we talked about earlier. So the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland, now we're going to talk about glands outside of the pituitary gland. The thyroid gland sits around C3, C4 cervical vertebra of the neck, and it secretes two hormones. It secretes thyroid hormone and it secretes calcitonin. Thyroid hormone can be further divided into T4 and T3. It's produced by the follicular cells, which make up most of your thyroid gland. And what it does, it increases your metabolic rate, it maintains blood pressure, and it also influences a lot of other organs. So it influences cartilage, bone, and muscle growth. Like if you have a deficiency in thyroid hormone, you can get a type of dwarfism. It's also very much important in the regulation of estrogen and progesterone. A lot of women that don't have enough thyroid hormone, they may have infertility issues too as well. And so you can see this is your larynx right here. The opening to your trachea is up here, and your thyroid gland is sitting about mid-neck. You have these follicular cells, and these follicular cells, they make a protein, and that's going to combine with iodine. Iodine is actually necessary to make thyroid hormone, and that thyroid hormone would be accumulated in that lake there. People who don't have enough iodine, we usually don't see it in this country. Usually it's in underdeveloped countries. But since iodine is needed to make thyroid hormone, what happens is that someone that doesn't have enough iodine, they make the protein. They make the protein that comes from the follicular cells, but because there's no iodine, that protein accumulates in the center part right here, and it causes it would accumulate in all of these areas here. And this would cause the entire thyroid gland to enlarge, calling it a goiter.